So today we'll be looking at the case of a show which is produced in the West, titled "To Catch a Predator." It is an interesting show because it gives an insight into the nature of the laws in the West regarding sexual offense and how it is visualized by the public at large. Dateline NBC uh, was a show, and To Catch a Predator was the series. So Dateline NBC is a show that has a reality TV aspect to it, where deals with legal issues. It's the host of the uh, specific series To Catch a Predator was Chris Hansen, and the whole point of the show was to nab potential sex offenders. In this show, Chris Hansen and his team collaborated with a group, Perverted Justice, which used to carry out such tasks. And their whole mode of operation was to ask volunteers to go to make an account and go into the chat rooms and lure men with intent to have sex or to solicit sexual conversation. So, uh, what would happen in these cases would be that online volunteers would pose as children or teenager and would wait on the chat sites for the adults to contact them. When and if these adults would contact them and talk about sex, the volunteers would collect their personal information and pass it on to the police. In the show, in order to make it more appealing to the public, they added one extra step. So basically, it consists of three steps: bait, lure, and punish. So, firstly, the decoy formed an account with the image of a children or a child and the names which generally children would choose and would wait for any adult to contact the person who was behind the account. The decoy was a person who was of legal age. So, if any adult in the second stage would initiate the contact with the child and talk about anything sexual or obscene, the volunteer would invite the adult to a location and would try to get personal information of the adult. In that location, in the third stage, Chris Hansen and the NBC crew would be present, and sometimes there would be police. Hansen would confront the adult, show him his chat with the supposed minor, and the police would then press charges on him. So, this is how this whole show operated. The convicted men, in very few cases, were acquitted, but mostly they had to register as sex offenders for the rest of their lives and faced prison sentences of around 5 to 10 years, sometimes even more. One guy faced three sentences of 25 to life imprisonment because of three strikes law. The charges that were pressed were soliciting sex from the minors and or sending them obscene pornographic material. Now let us look at the few controversies which the show quoted. The first thing that the show was criticized for was legal entrapment. So basically, the people didn't have the knowledge of an actual crime that was committed or a potential suspect. What they would do basically is set up an account and wait. They would know that the individual would be present in the chat rooms or somewhere and would contact them, adult, or they hoped that would be the case for their show. When such adult would contact the person who was pretending to be a minor, the minor would make the person believe that he was the minor and would also sometimes try to uh, entice the individual, which we would see later in the next parts of the slide. The second thing the show was criticized for was a suicide that a person was caught in one such operation committed suicide, and it created problem for the police and for the NBC crew because they were held responsible for the suicide by the person because they were trying to entrap that person. The third thing the show was criticized for was the fact that people behind the show would select the volunteers who would who presumably would be sexually appealing to the people and would also appear young enough to pass off as minor. So they would select those decoys which looked young but were of the legal age and perhaps were good enough so as to incite the other person. What was interesting in all of this is that it gave an insight into the mind of the public and the way the Western law works. The whole case in the show showed an important fact, or basically three important factors. Firstly, because the adults were impersonating the minors all the time, the solicitation and the imagery, any imagery that the person on the other end, the potential sexual offender, was sending, never reached minors and never harmed anyone. However, in many jurisdictions, the law regarded and continues to regard that the accused must believe that the victim is minor for accusation of a predatory behavior to be substantiated. Even if the victim is not a minor, the accused is not let off. Now, it is very surprising because if one argues that the harm is caused to a person who cannot consent, and the person who could consent or is of legal age could consent would face no harm by agreeing to sex or by being agree or by agreeing to chat about sex or receiving these images, the consequentialist side of the law is completely missing from the picture. The second thing was that incitement by the other was not a valid offense. Stone Phillips, who was a former Dateline anchor, uh, finally accepted that in many cases, the volunteer, the person who was in the decoy, brought the topic of the sex first in order to entice the adult, and only then the adult dwelled into the subject because he presumed that the volunteer was interested, because the minor was interested. He defended this tactic and said that it was not entrapment because once the hook is baited, the fish jump and run with it like you wouldn't believe. That is to say, that once they cast the net, or once they convince the other person that the minor was interested in sex, then the adult would behave what they believe really as he was. In one of the cases, and the transcripts of this case is also available online, a firefighter who proposed having sex with a presumed 14-year-old wrote, "It is wrong and illegal." Perhaps he realized that soliciting sex from a minor was illegal and morally wrong. However, a few minutes later, he came back online to go on meeting with the presumed minor. And the reason for that appears to be that he gave into the temptation. He realized, perhaps in his mind, that the 14-year-old also wanted it, and thus, by not doing it, and by harping on to the concept of legality and morality, he was just letting a chance go away. This is also an interesting thing to consider, and it will be very important as we discuss how all of this combines to form a view about how the West views these offenses. So, why is all of this important? It is important to recognize, and this is perhaps the most key aspect of all of this, is that sexual offenses in the West are not geared to any of the following: harm, context about enticement and provocation, and an intent to stop. One of the key features, and this is where a philosophy comes into the play, is that Evola noted that individualization of the sexual want was what was behind the victory of lust over eros. What it means is that a romantic love is basically consisting of some form of an acceptance by both the partners that this is what it is. However, when the sexual want becomes individualized, it becomes the want of a person, and then it transforms itself into completely into lust. This is important because when this lust attaches itself to the greatest sin in the West, an exercise of power, it becomes a sexual offense. Thus, the problem the West believes with the sexual offense is not coming from the factors like consequentialism, right? It does not come from factor that it is objectification or dehumanizing of the other dehumanization of the other person. It comes solely from the fact that when the power attaches itself to this lust, and this lust is basically celebrated in the West believes that it corrupts this lust. Probably the best way to put it would be to remember the quote. Yeah, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Such sexual offense is divorced from any other component of sex or its nature, but is directed to the presence of two attributes, power and lust, and that is how the Western law is defined. Such a measure comes from a dualist perspective because it recognizes the act as independently being the source and the end of the problem. Thus, the context is irrelevant. Thus, the lust becomes the foe, for it separates the boundary between the sex offender and an offender. And this hints at a virtue based moral system present in the West. What is interesting in all of this is that this virtue based moral system stands firm even if there is no established harm, there is enticement from the other side, and even if the presumed minor was the one to initiate the meeting. The reason for that is because all of these three factors could play themselves in the eros, but because the lust is distanced from the eros, the lust finds itself to be corrupted by the power. The lust, corrupted by the power, finds itself as the sole basis for to be defined as immoral, and thus forms the basis of the Western morality.